This is a ship carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil across the Persian Gulf right now. You would think moving cargo worth $150 million would make its owners rich. But here's a secret. On most days, that ship is barely breaking even. There are roughly 800 of these vessels on the water, worth over $80 billion combined, and a hidden force quietly controls whether they earn $12,000 a day or $400,000 a day. So why would the world's largest energy companies depend on ships whose earnings can flip overnight? And what happens when a single geopolitical crisis rewrites the economics of every tanker on the ocean at once? To understand this, we have to start with an uncomfortable truth about oil shipping that almost nobody talks about. The ships we are talking about are called Very Large Crude Carriers, or VLCCs. At 200,000 to 320,000 deadweight tons, they are among the largest moving objects ever built by humans. A single VLCC can carry enough crude oil to fuel a mid-sized country for days. They run the critical arteries of global energy, from the Persian Gulf to refineries in Asia, from West Africa to the ports of Europe and North America. About 60% of the world's seaborne crude oil moves on vessels like these. But here is the thing most people do not realize. The oil itself does not belong to the ship owner. The owner is simply the truck driver, paid to move someone else's cargo from point A to point B. And the rate they get paid for that job changes every single day. Sometimes every single hour. Most very large crude carriers don't operate on long-term contracts. They trade in the spot market, fixing a single voyage at a time and negotiating a new rate for every cargo. One week the market is tight and rates are flying. The next week, 3 vessels show up at the same loading port chasing the same cargo, and rates collapse. The Baltic Exchange, the London-based benchmark for global shipping rates, tracks those ships' earnings daily. In early 2026, benchmark routes like the Persian Gulf to Asia were showing daily earnings between $110,000 and $130,000 per day. That sounds enormous, and it is. But here is where it gets complicated. Those numbers represent the peak of a cycle. For long stretches between those peaks, the same routes were generating $20,000 to $30,000 a day, sometimes less. During acute geopolitical shocks, individual fixtures have reached $400,000 to $424,000 per day. A single voyage lasting 3 to 4 weeks at those rates can generate more revenue than some ships earn in an entire year. But those moments are rare, violent, and short-lived. And the math only works if you survive the troughs in between. Now here is the economic reality that most people never see. Running a very large crude carrier is brutally expensive. Every single day, whether it is earning or not. Start with the crew. A very large crude carrier requires a crew of roughly 25 to 30 specialized officers and sailors. Crew costs alone run $5,000 to $8,000 per day. Then add insurance, hull, and machinery, plus protection and indemnity coverage. For a vessel this size, that runs another $3,000 to $5,000 per day. Maintenance, dry docking reserves, stores, lubricants, and administration add several thousand more. When you total it up, modern very large crude carrier operating expenses cluster in the low to mid-teens of thousands of dollars per day. Call it $12,000 to $16,000 just to keep the lights on. But that is not the full picture. Most ships carry debt. Add interest payments and depreciation on a $120 million vessel, and your total cash break even lands somewhere between $25,000 and $35,000 per day, depending on how leveraged the owner is and what fuel costs are doing. So when rates sit at $20,000 a day, the ship is losing money. When rates hit $110,000 a day, the owner is generating operating leverage that is almost obscene. A few weeks at $100,000 a day or more can cover a large share of an entire year's fixed costs. That is the game. Survive the lows, capture the spikes, and hope the timing works in your favor. The biggest driver of VLCC earnings isn't oil demand, it's distance. Tanker owners do not get paid per barrel. They get paid per ton mile, meaning the further the cargo travels, the more the ship earns. And this is where geopolitics becomes the most powerful force in tanker economics. When trade routes get disrupted, when wars break out, when chokepoints get threatened, when cargoes are forced onto longer detours, effective vessel supply drops. Ships are tied up longer on each voyage, fewer vessels are available to fix new cargoes. Rates spike. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most important choke point in VLCC economics. About 20% of the world's seaborne oil passes through that 33-mile-wide channel every single day. Any credible threat to that passage, military tension, Iranian naval exercises, sanctions enforcement, sends charterers scrambling to secure tonnage earlier, tightening available supply and pushing rates up fast. The Red Sea crisis of 2024 showed exactly how this works. Attacks on commercial vessels near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait forced ships to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope. A voyage that previously took 25 days suddenly took 40. Vessel availability collapsed. Freight rates surged. Tanker owners who happened to have ships in the right position at the right moment made a year's worth of profit in a few weeks. Here is where the system gets genuinely counterintuitive. You would assume that when oil prices rise, tanker earnings rise with them because the cargo is more valuable and rates go up. But that is not how it works. Academic research confirms that tanker freight rates and crude oil prices are correlated over medium and long horizons. But the short-term relationship is messy and often inverse. When oil prices spike sharply, demand can soften. When OPEC cuts production, fewer barrels move, and vessel demand drops. When oil is cheap, refineries run hard, importers stock up, and tankers get busy. What actually moves freight rates in the short term is capacity, specifically the mismatch between how many ships are available and how many cargoes need to move. Oil prices set the backdrop. Geopolitics and supply constraints set the rate. This is why owners of very large crude carriers sit glued to news feeds, tracking events that have nothing to do with shipping. A ceasefire announcement in the Middle East can crash rates in 24 hours. An escalation can send them to the moon. The cargo is always there. The question is which route it takes and how many ships are available to carry it. Not every tanker owner benefits from volatility equally. The structure of your balance sheet determines whether a rate spike saves you or whether a prolonged trough destroys you. Highly leveraged owners, those who financed ships with heavy debt during the last cycle peak, face a brutal math problem. When rates sit below $25,000 to $35,000 per day for extended periods, they risk breaching loan covenants, triggering forced sales, or laying up vessels to cut costs. The shipping graveyard is full of companies that bought ships at the top of the market, took on maximum debt, and got caught in a multi-year downturn. On the other side, low-leverage owners with modern, fuel-efficient fleets can survive the troughs and then capture the full upside of a rate spike without being strangled by debt service. During the 2024 to 2026 cycle, the owners who came out richest were not necessarily the biggest. They were the ones who had kept their balance sheets clean when everyone else was ordering aggressively. The cruel irony of tanker economics is this. The moments of peak optimism, when rates are flying and profits are huge, are exactly when the seeds of the next bust get planted. Owners order new ships. Yards fill up. 2 to 3 years later, those vessels hit the water just as the market softens. Supply overwhelms demand. Rates crash. And the cycle starts again. Today, the industry is navigating a new layer of complexity on top of its usual volatility. Environmental regulations are tightening. The International Maritime Organization's carbon intensity rules are applying pressure on older, less efficient vessels, forcing owners to either slow steam, invest in scrubbers, or scrap aging tonnage earlier than planned. At the same time, the shadow fleet, tankers operating outside Western regulatory frameworks, and many of them moving sanctioned Russian and Iranian crude, has absorbed a significant chunk of global capacity in very large crude carriers. Analysts estimate the shadow fleet now comprises several hundred vessels, effectively removing them from the mainstream spot market and tightening available supply for legitimate cargoes. That structural tightness has been one of the quiet factors supporting rates in 2025 and into 2026. If sanctions regimes shift, if geopolitical settlements bring shadow fleet vessels back into the regulated market, the supply balance could flip dramatically. Hundreds of vessels re-entering the mainstream market would crush rates almost overnight. Whether that happens in 2026 or 2030, nobody knows. But the threat is real, and owners of very large crude carriers are already positioning for it. So, next time you fill up your car or hear about oil prices on the news, remember, somewhere on the Persian Gulf, a ship the size of 4 football fields is playing a high-stakes gamble, earning everything or barely surviving, depending on a war, a blockade, or a decision made in a political backroom. Like and subscribe.